Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 73 in the book of Hebrews. And today is going to be the best of Hebrews, volume 4. We're just going to look back at chapter 11, the so-called Hall of Fame of Faith. And the reason is because faith is right at the center of the pleasure of God. And without faith, it's impossible to please him. So we did, a little while ago, 2 weeks of podcasts in Hebrews 11. And we lingered a bit and kind of went back to the Old Testament a bit because we all missed the Old Testament. And learned that faith is how you consider God when some circumstances are bad. And in a sense, faith is only applied in adversity. So for all of us who may be facing adversity today, this is a very important chapter to encourage us. So faith is how we consider the person of God before the promises of God are evident. So there's this time element that is before. And what do we do with our soul intent, the intent of our soul in the meantime, in this before time? So this should be a reassurance to all of us, that we can have faith in our difficulty. It is one of the most encouraging chapters in the Bible. And these are not perfect people. There's stuff not to emulate in every single one of these people we're going to mention. But the point of the chapter is to highlight how they wrestled with faith and came to a conclusion about faith. So we too, like them, live in a world before the promises of God are fully evident. So we have a lot to learn. We live in the same milieu as they do. So from Abraham, we learned that he had faith when he didn't know where he was going. So he had directional faith. And from Sarah, we learned that she has a faith because she considered him faithful. So she thought about God in a certain way. So she had a faith in her world before the promises were true, specifically in the way she considered God. So Sarah had a considered God. Then there's those who have this goal in life who they wanted to die in faith. That is, they wanted to take their faith all the way to the end, the finish line. And we have enough from God to be confident in all the way to death. So then there's Abraham, who considered God not just a directional faith, but he also considered God able to raise Isaac from the dead. So he was the first one, and every single Christian today has to have the faith of Abraham. Why is that? Because it's a resurrection faith. So he was the first to believe what every Christian must believe. That is that Jesus was raised from the dead and God has resurrection power. And then from Isaac, we learned this, that his faith was demonstrated in prayer, and specifically a prayer that time traveled. So a timeless prayer, because we learned from him that you can shoot down the corridor of time to influence the future. And so we can have faith in our prayers going down to future generations. Then Moses considered the reproach of being with the people of God as precious, more precious than the gold that he had been raised with. And so from Moses we learn the value of faith. And then the Israelites. So 100% of the surviving Israelites had faith in the blood. They were under the blood of the doorpost of the Passover. And then they voted with their feet in going down the 3,500 foot deep Red Sea. So they had this blood faith, which is so important because in Hebrews we find out that there's a better blood. Then in Jericho we learned about obedience faith. You march out there 7 times. And then from Rahab, we asked, who belongs to me that God wants to belong to him? So she brings her whole family along in rescue. So she gets this family faith, kind of this associative faith. Then from Gideon, who we find hiding, we find him, the Lord addresses him as a man of valor. So faith has this element of how God sees me before I see myself. So Gideon gets the identity faith correct. Then from Barak, we find a faith of renewed obedience for something the Lord had told him a long time ago. So he demonstrates this renewed faith in an old request. And then from Samson, we find a guy who gives everything only to obtain a beginning. So he has, in a sense, an incomplete or unfinished task, just like everybody else. They didn't quite get it all. Then from Jephthah, he chose the person of God despite the knuckle-headed people of God. And he fights bravely externally eventually in the story, but he fights internally, and he demonstrates that this battle is internal, and he gets the internal battle right before he gets the external battle right. Then from Samuel, great line in him in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, where he learns he grew, and the Lord was with him, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. So from Samuel, we learned a word-honoring faith. So faith is using the future, that is the promises of God, to help with our present and help in our hard circumstances. And then the Hebrews chapter 11 ends with this anonymous list of people who wandered and were killed with the sword, and who were stoned, and who were sawn in two. And all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised. And they're described as the world not being worthy of them. So they had this worthy faith. So you may find that your faith, as you struggle with faith, is anonymous and unfamous and secret and certainly difficult, maybe more private, but probably heroic. It'll be transformative and internal. It'll involve obedience of action, and then this discipline and difficulty of the mind and of the soul. And here's the thing, is God has given you his presence, the reality of his person, so that you may have faith. You have everything you need. You have himself and the person of God. So as you struggle with directional faith and considered faith and resurrection faith and blood faith and family faith and identity faith and all these other kinds of faith, know that God has given you everything you need to please him with faith. And someday, we'll find you in your Hall of Fame of Faith. See you there.